Today we're going to be starting chapter 2. So the stuff that we learn in chapter 2 is so important. We utilize these things in chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 7, chapter 10, like this idea of this hypothesis testing. And today we're going to focus on writing hypotheses, okay, and what the hypotheses mean. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to look back at the 2016 Detroit Lions. During the regular season of play, the 2016 Detroit Lions had a 9-7 overall record. For those of you that aren't familiar with sports, when they give a record, the first is the number of wins, and then the second one is the number of losses. So it was a good year for the Lions. They won more than they lost. Imagine that. So at home, they were 6-2, so 6 wins, 2 losses, which results in a winning percentage of, we do not divide 6 by 2, friends. Remember, what you want to do is take your successes, which is going to be 6, over the total number of games. 6 plus 2 is 8, so we're going to take 6 over 8. We know that 6 over 8 is 3/4, and so we know that that's 75%. So on the road, they weren't nearly as successful than they were at home. So let's think about it. If they were 9-7 overall, they won 9 games overall, they won 6 at home, which means that they only won 3 on the road. And if they won 7 overall and 2 at home, if they lost 7 overall and 2 of those losses were at home, and that means 5 of those were on the road. So again, their 3-5 road record results in a winning percentage of only 3 successes. But again, the total wasn't 5, the total was 3 plus 5, which is 8. And if you divide 3 by 8, that gives you 0.375, which would be 37.5%. So one of the things we're going to do is construct a two-way table to help us summarize and attempt to analyze the information. And so in a two-way table, usually I like to put the 2 different contexts as the columns. And in this problem, the 2 contexts are the home versus away. There could be lots of different contexts, like right versus left, home versus away, blue uniforms versus white uniforms, that kind of a thing. And then the rows I like to have as the outcomes, or the categories. And in this case, it's win versus loss. And a lot of times what you'll find is that our categories are going to be success versus failure. Okay. So what are those what's the extra column in row 4 here? Well, that's going to be for our total of each. And so the two-way table helps us organize this information. So we know at home, they won 6 games and they lost 2 games for a total of 8 games. And away, they won 3 games, lost 5 games for a total of 8 games. And notice if we add 6 and 3 is 9, 2 and 5 is 7, 8 and 8 is 16. Notice that 9 plus 7 is also 6, and then that matches that overall record that they had given us here. Okay, so that's what a two-way table looks like, and that's one of our goals, is to have that. And so again, if we wanted to analyze this information, we could, like we did in the paragraph, compare the winning percentages. So again, just like we saw up here, the home was 6 out of 8, which is 75%. So again, we take the successes that we see in the top row over the total that we see in the bottom row. And away, we have 3 successes out of 8, which we said it was 37.5%. And so what we can see is that the Lions performed better at home. Now, there are two possible explanations for why they performed better at home. One of these is that the was just because it was due to chance, okay? That their ability is the same. And that the difference in performance is just due to random chance. Okay, so that's one possibility. Just happened to end up that way. Their ability is the same, but there was a difference in performance due to random chance. Okay. The second possible explanation, however, is that their ability really is greater at home. Basically, we're saying that that truly is special and not due to random chance. Okay. And so this idea is something that we're going to use to write our hypotheses. This idea that it could be random chance or it could be something special. And when you think about the court of law, we have innocence until proven guilty. What we're always going to do is we're always going to assume that random chance was responsible. Okay, so that means that of the two options that we listed above, we're going to always assume number one. We assume innocence. We assume that there wasn't a difference in ability. Okay, so we assume that innocence, that there wasn't a difference in ability. What we would need is that we would need convincing evidence that random chance was not responsible in order to claim a difference in ability. Okay, so we assume that there's innocence, but what we try to do is we try to say, convince our jury that we really can't say that there's innocence. We have to let that go. And so we never really show that claim number two is true. But what we do is we show that since there's evidence to refute claim number one, so because there's going to be evidence to say that claim number one isn't feasible, we will support claim number two instead. So in this case, it would be like the jury saying, I can't say that they're innocent, so therefore I have to say we're guilty. So in our case, we're not convicting anybody. We're going to say because we have evidence that it's not random chance, that we're going to say that there is a difference in ability. Okay, so just like the judicial system, claim number one is saying that the defendant did not commit the crime. And claim number two is saying that the defendant did commit the crime. Okay. In a courtroom, evidence might not prove that the person is guilty, but rather shows that they're not innocent. And so that's kind of what we're doing here with our hypotheses. Okay. So we're going to be going through this today. We're going to be learning how to state hypotheses. And again, before we do that, I'm just going to remind you that performance is like a sample. And ability is that hypothetical thing, which is like in a regular stats class, like a population, which considers every possibility. And so when we state hypotheses, we're always going to talk about ability in our hypotheses, because a hypothesis is something that we're guessing. We don't need to guess about a performance. A performance is a fact. Like, we know that a performance could be better than something else, but we're hypothesizing about ability because, again, of that hypothetical nature of ability, with that having the infinite number of times. So our null hypothesis, there are going to be two types of hypotheses. One of them is going to be our null hypothesis. And our null hypothesis we're going to call the H sub 0. And the null hypothesis is like that claim 1 we talked about on the other page. It's going to be the claim that the ability is the same in two different contexts. Okay. This is the neutral position that we must assume. Okay. Again, innocent until proven guilty. We're assuming this neutral position, that nothing special happened, that the ability is the same. Okay. The other hypothesis that we're going to consider is the alternate hypothesis or alternative hypothesis, and we call that H sub A. Okay, so H sub O and H sub A. So this is the claim that the ability is different, okay? So that the ability is better or worse, sometimes we'll say, or different in one context in comparison to another. Okay, so the alternate hypothesis is something special that we are trying to show. So this is kind of where, if we think back to chapter 1, what we were doing is we saw performances that we thought might be special, and we were deciding if we had enough evidence to say that they were special or not. And in chapter 2, we're just going to do the same thing, but we're just going to formalize that process, okay? So, but we always assume that the null hypothesis is true, assume that nothing special is happening, and then we'll see if we do have enough evidence to reject that and show that there is something special that actually happened, okay? Notice here that we always discuss ability in our hypotheses. You got, sorry, my cats, sorry. That when we're doing this, we always talk about ability, okay? So this is a little note I want us to make sure that we're always talking about ability. In your HO and HA, because we'll always write both, okay? So we're always going to discuss ability in HO and HA. We don't hypothesize about performances. Performances are facts. We don't have to hypothesize about them. So we'll always talk about ability. Now, so when we're doing the hypotheses, here are some things that let's make sure that we include in the hypotheses, okay? So also in the hypotheses, we're going to include like the who and the when, because who we're talking about is important, and like we said, things can differ from year to year. We're going to talk about the actual ability, and like the ability, so again, the null will say same and the alternate will say that it's different somehow. We're going to be talking about the action in question. So like, are we talking about the ability to win? Are we talking about the ability to make 3-point shots? Are we talking about the ability to grow plants? Okay. And then the two different contexts. So are we talking about at home and away? Are we talking right-handed, left-handed? Are we talking about in the spring or in the summer? Those kind of things. Okay, so those are the things that we'll always have in our hypotheses. And again, like this is so important because we're going to be writing hypotheses this whole chapter and in several other chapters going forward. So here's an example. In 2010, the Detroit Tigers had a record of 15-12 in the month of June and a record of 11-15 in the month of July. Do these performances indicate they have a greater ability to win in June? And it wants us to state the hypotheses. So notice that hypotheses, like this is plural. So even if it doesn't say state the null and alternate hypotheses, when it says ES, that means you need both all the time, okay? So let's start by writing our null hypothesis, and it should be labeled HO, and we should always start with that one, okay? So our who and our when are the Detroit Tigers in 2010, so that will be here. So the 2010 Detroit Tigers. Now we're going to talk about ability, and in our null hypothesis, we talk about the same ability. And the action is we're talking about them winning, so they have the same ability to win. And the context that they're talking about are the two different months, June and July. And that's our null hypothesis. Now for our alternate hypothesis, that means that we're going to look at where the performances were different. And notice that in the question talks about having a greater ability. So that's what we're going to use in our alternate hypothesis. So that way you know to use that you're a greater ability in June instead of like a lesser ability in July, if that makes sense. Anyway, so the alternate hypothesis like really mimics the null hypothesis, but instead of saying there's the same ability, we're going to say that there's a difference ability. So we can say that the 2010 Detroit Tigers, that's still our who. This time we're going to say that they have a greater ability. Again, the action is if they're winning. So in June, and then instead of and, because when you compare, something is greater than something else. So we're going to say to win in June than in July. So the null and alternate hypotheses are going to look very similar to each other, except one talks about having the same ability, the other one talks about having a different ability. So again, they're always going to look pretty similar. So here's a you-try question. It says, do PSEP French students have a lesser ability to get a B or higher on tests later in the year? So you investigate. You found that in 2018, 40 out of 60 PSEP French students received a B or higher on the Unit 1 test, but only 30 out of 60 PSEP French students received a B or higher on the Unit 7 test. So we're going to state the null and alternate hypotheses for this question. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can write a null and alternate hypothesis based on what we wrote in the previous example. And then unpause the video and I'll show you what it should look like and you can make your corrections, okay? So go ahead and press pause. Okay, so this one was a little wordier. But your null hypothesis should say that PSEP French students in 2018 have the same ability to get a B or higher, that was our action, on the Unit 1 and the Unit 7 test. Those were the two contexts specifically. The alternate then is that PSEP French students in 2018 have a lesser ability to get a B or higher on the Unit 7 test than on the Unit 1 test. Why did I choose lesser ability? Because that's what our question was asking here. It was asking if they have a lesser ability to get a B or higher on tests later in the year. So because that was here, that's why I put that, that I chose lesser ability in my alternate hypothesis. So that's kind of a clue in the question that they're asking, which one you should choose, okay? Okay, so the goal today is for you to write hypotheses and to make two-way tables, but those are pretty easy. It's just organizing that information. But I want to talk to you guys about what this chapter is going to be outlining. This chapter is going to be outlining testing hypotheses, okay? And when we talk about a hypothesis test, it is a formal, okay, formal process used to decide between competing hypotheses. Okay. And when we have this process, one of the first things that we do, so these are the steps of the hypothesis test, is going to be to write our hypotheses. So that's what we looked at today. The next thing we're going to do is to determine a specific test statistic. I'm going to define that for you today. Then we're going to talk about how, well, at some point we'll talk about how then we can simulate that, kind of like what we talked about in chapter 1. We simulate a specific thing we want to, a performance that we want to see if it's special. We're going to do something called find the p-value. I ran out of room. And then we're going to draw a conclusion. Just made it right, okay? So those are going to be the steps that we perform in a hypothesis test, and we'll be doing all of these throughout chapter 2, okay? So today our goal is to write HO and HA, but I also want to introduce to you this idea of the test statistic. So what a test statistic is a test statistic is, I'm picking the color, a test statistic is a measure that's calculated from performances. Okay, remember performances actually happened, okay? So it's a measure calculated from performances, and it's used as evidence in a hypothesis test. And we're going to see if it is special. Okay. So we're going to take this test statistic, this thing that actually happened, and we're going to see in our simulation if it is special or not. So the test statistic's kind of like the performance we use, and we're like, okay, is this special or not? It's going to be our cutoff. Now, in this specific chapter, we're going to focus on one test statistic, and that test statistic is going to be considered the difference in proportion or percentage, okay? So a proportion would be like a decimal, like 0.5, percentage would be like 50%. But this is the test statistic that we're going to be doing all throughout chapter 2, okay? So all throughout chapter 2, our test statistic is going to be a difference in proportion, okay? So it says to find the test statistic for the Detroit Lions. And so if we wanted to find the test statistic for the Detroit Lions, what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, I want us to talk about the name of the test statistic. And I don't want us just to say difference in proportion. So remember when we looked back at the Detroit Lions, I know this was a couple pages ago, but we were looking at their wins and losses. And so we have these percentages here, and what we're looking at is their win percentage. And so that's what we're going to say here is going to be the difference in win. I'll even put percentage instead of proportion. It's fine. Okay. And I want us to specifically say what we're comparing. The difference is that we're going to take home minus away. Sorry about my little scribbles there. Okay. So again, what difference are you taking? We're taking home minus away. So what we usually do is we do the better one minus the worse one. And home had a better percentage, so we'll take home minus away. If we were comparing right versus left, we could say right minus left, etc. So these are things that we would want for the name. And now we're going to look at the value of the test statistic. For the value, now we're actually going to take this. We're going to take the home percentage minus the away percentage. And if we look back, the home percentage was 75% and the away percentage was 37.5%. So we'll take 75% minus 37.5%, and that actually gives us 37.5%. And what we would do is we're going to find out, was this performance special? That's what we would do in a hypothesis test, okay? So in our hypothesis test, what we want to do is we want to see how likely it is to get a difference in win percentage of at least 37.5% just by random chance. And then like we did in chapter 1, if you see that it happens very often in our simulation, we're going to say it's not special. And if it doesn't happen often in our simulation, then that means that it was special. And we'll do that throughout this chapter. Okay, so that's our goal for today, is to write our hypotheses.